There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that the very thing that saves us can also be what, slowly and silently, destroys us. If you walk into the depths of the National Library of France today and ask to see the notebooks from the late 19th century, you will be met with a safety protocol that looks like something out of a science fiction movie. You cannot touch them without lead-lined gloves or protective suits, and you must sign a liability waiver. More than a century later, those sheets of paper still emit an invisible, lethal glow. Those papers belong to a woman many think they know, but whose true story has been buried under the dust of school textbooks and the myth of the scientific saint. We almost always see her in the same grainy, black and white photos, wearing a dark dress, her face stern, her hair pulled back, an austere figure who seems to have no blood in her veins. But behind that woman in black, who walked silently through a world designed exclusively for men, was an absolute rebel. She was an immigrant who arrived in Paris with empty pockets and ended up dismantling everything humanity thought it knew about matter. The paradox surrounding her existence is almost poetic in its cruelty. Marie Curie dedicated every conscious second of her life to pursuing a substance that promised to be the fountain of youth and the ultimate cure for cancer, a blue light she called her little luminous children. What she did not know, or perhaps what she chose to ignore with superhuman stubbornness, was that this very substance, radium, was devouring her cells and consuming her bone marrow while she handled it with her bare hands. She lived surrounded by an energy that could save millions of lives, but in the process it was stealing hers. This duality between creation and destruction defines her legacy. It was a legacy that did not just stay in the laboratories, but followed her to her final resting place. In 1995, when the French government decided to transfer her remains to the Panthéon in Paris, the majestic temple where the nation's illustrious men rest, something happened that left scientists speechless. Upon opening the coffin of this Polish woman who had fled to the French capital to escape Russian oppression, they discovered that her body was not the only thing that needed protection. Her coffin had to be encased in layers of lead, nearly 3 centimeters thick, to prevent the radiation accumulated in her bones from escaping into the outside world. Marie Curie didn't just discover radioactivity, she became radioactivity. She was the first woman to enter the Pantheon on her own merits, shattering a gender barrier that seemed made of steel. And she did it as a foreigner who, despite the humiliation and contempt of the French elite of the era, ended up becoming the indispensable architect of modern physics. We are about to begin a journey that will take us from the underground classrooms of an occupied Warsaw to the battlefields of World War I, through laboratories improvised in bone-chilling sheds. This is not the typical dry story of a scientist who won 2 Nobel Prizes. This is the chronicle of a woman who looked directly into the heart of the atom when no one else dared, who faced scandals that nearly destroyed her career, and who ultimately handed us the keys to the universe in exchange for her own life. Welcome to K History, and this is the true story of Marie Curie. Before we dive deep into this journey, take a quick moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see our community connecting from all corners of the globe. To understand Marie Curie's almost superhuman tenacity, we first have to understand the suffocating world into which she was born. In 1867, Warsaw was not the capital of a free nation. It was under the iron fist of the Russian Empire. Imagine being born in a country that on paper and on the maps of the time technically did not exist. The Polish people lived in a constant state of resistance against a process of Russification that sought to erase their identity, their language, and their customs. Maria Salomea Sklodowska, her birth name, grew up in a city where speaking Polish in schools or public offices was strictly prohibited and could land you straight in prison, or worse, exiled to Siberia. Her family was no ordinary family. They were intellectuals in a world where thinking for oneself was an act of treason. Her parents were teachers, and their home was an intellectual battlefield where education was considered the only weapon capable of liberating Poland in the future. From a very young age, Maria learned to live a double life. At school, she and her classmates had to pretend they were studying official Russian history and praying according to Orthodox rites whenever the Tsar's inspectors made surprise appearances in the hallways. There is an anecdote that perfectly defines her childhood. Marie was the brightest student in her class. When the Russian inspector arrived to test the children, the teachers always called on her to answer in perfect Russian, hiding the fact that just minutes earlier they had been studying forbidden Polish literature. She complied with icy precision, but the moment the inspector left the room, little Maria would burst into tears from the humiliation of having to hide who she truly was. This oppressive environment did not break her. Instead, it forged an iron discipline within her and a natural distrust of imposed authority. Polish cultural resistance was not just about politics, it was a mysticism of knowledge. In the Warsaw of her childhood, reading a forbidden book was just as important as wielding a rifle. Marie grew up watching her father lose jobs and prestige because he refused to bow to Russian bureaucrats, plunging the family into a poverty that would scar her forever. Yet, amidst the shortage of food and coal to keep warm during brutal winters, a book of physics or poetry was never missing. It was in those shadows, under the watchful eye of the Tsar's soldiers, that Marie understood that the mind is the only territory no army can invade. Her childhood was not a time for games. It was intensive training in resilience, patience, and courage, qualities that would serve her years later when facing tons of radioactive ore in a freezing Paris laboratory. While the political pressure of the Russian occupation was a constant weight on young Maria's shoulders, tragedy struck her intimate world in a way that would prove deeply traumatic. In the Sklodowski household, death was not an abstract concept, but a presence that knocked on the door with terrifying frequency. The first major fracture in her world occurred when Marie was just 7 years old. At the time, infectious diseases were the true monsters under the bed, and tuberculosis was the most feared of all. Her mother, Bronislawa, a highly educated woman who had been the headmistress of a school for girls, contracted the disease. In a desperate act of sacrifice and love, her mother stopped kissing and hugging her children to avoid infecting them, a physical distance that, for young Marie, left an impossible void to fill. The family's financial situation, already battered by fines and political reprisals against her father, forced the Sklodowskis to rent out rooms in their home to students. It was through one of these boarders that tragedy struck again. One of the tenants brought typhus into the house. Zofia, Maria's eldest sister and her great role model, caught it quickly. In 1876, while the family prayed and fought to keep her alive, Zofia passed away. Marie, who was only 8 years old at the time, watched the joy in her home vanish instantly. Zofia was not just a sister. She was the bridge between childhood games and the maturity Maria was forced to reach ahead of her time. But the final blow came just 2 years later. In 1878, tuberculosis finally claimed her mother. For a 10-year-old girl who had already lost her older sister, her mother's death completely demolished her religious faith. Marie watched her devout, kind, and brilliant mother die slowly despite all prayers and sacrifices. That brutal loss triggered a profound shift inside her. She abandoned the Catholicism of her childhood and adopted a rational skepticism. She decided that if God could not save the people she loved, then knowledge, science, and logic would be her new sanctuaries. These years of constant mourning transformed a curious young girl into a teenager with a melancholic gaze but a determination of steel. Maria learned very early on that life is fragile and that time is a scarce resource that cannot be wasted. This maturity, forged in grief, explains why years later she was capable of spending days on end without eating or sleeping in a laboratory. Having survived the total loss of her emotional core, hunger or physical exhaustion were merely minor inconveniences. Tragedy did not stop her. It drove her to seek the answers in books and nature that neither religion nor politics could provide. Amidst the emotional chaos of losing her mother and sister, a figure emerged who would become Marie's intellectual compass, her father, Vladislav. This man was not just a high school physics and mathematics teacher. He was a true polymath who spoke 5 languages, translated foreign poetry, and possessed an unwavering faith in the power of education. After being demoted by Russian authorities due to his Polish patriotism, Władysław was forced to bring home much of the school laboratory equipment he was no longer permitted to use. Thus, the Sklodowski home was transformed into a sanctuary of knowledge, where test tubes and barometers sat alongside teacups on the dining room table. Marie remembered watching with absolute fascination the glass cabinet where her father kept his scientific instruments. To her, these objects were not tools of work, but magical treasures holding the secrets to how the universe operated. Władysław, far from keeping his children away from these complex subjects, integrated them into his world. Every Saturday night, he sat with them to read classical literature or explain the latest advances in European scientific research. He didn't just teach them formulas, he taught them to observe, to question, and to reason. It was he who planted the idea in Marie that logical thinking was the most powerful tool for confronting a world trying to silence them. Despite their financial hardships, Władysław never allowed his children's curiosity to wither. When they had no money for new books, he would explain the laws of thermodynamics or the composition of matter himself in a way so vibrant that Marie forgot the cold inside the house. This man was responsible for Marie developing an intellectual confidence rare for a young woman of her era. In a century when it was believed that the female brain was not designed for the hard sciences, her father treated her as an academic equal. That seed of curiosity, watered by the strict discipline he demanded, ensured that Marie would not settle for simply being an educated young woman. Instead, she aspired to unravel the mysteries hidden in plain sight across the natural world. In the late 19th century, if you were a young woman in Poland and had the audacity to want to attend university, you ran into an insurmountable wall. Official institutions in Warsaw, controlled by the Tsarist regime, strictly banned women from enrolling. The destiny the world offered someone like Maria was marriage, motherhood, or, at best, a life dedicated to dressmaking or primary education. But the thirst for knowledge at the time was so contagious that Polish intellectuals created something truly astonishing and dangerous: the Flying University, or Floating University. This name was not a poetic metaphor, it was a tactical necessity. It was a clandestine educational network that constantly changed locations to evade the Tsar's secret police. One night, anatomy classes would be held in the basement of a bakery. The next night, sociology would be discussed in the attic of a lawyer's house. And a few days later, Maria would find herself studying chemistry in a private living room behind closed curtains. Studying chemistry in a private living room behind closed curtains. Participating in this was an act of pure rebellion. If they were discovered, the professors would end up in Siberia and the students in dark prisons. But Marie's hunger for knowledge was far stronger than the fear of Russian bayonets. In these makeshift classrooms, Marie came into contact with the most brilliant minds of her country. There, they didn't teach the distorted history imposed by the occupiers. Instead, they debated positivism, Darwinism, and the new frontiers of science. It was a vibrant environment where men and women treated each other as intellectual equals. Marie, who already worked during the day to support her family, dedicated her nights and her few free moments to these secret classes. Sometimes, after an exhausting day, she would walk through dark streets beneath the snow to reach an address that had been passed to her, almost in a whisper, just to read a physics treatise that wasn't available in the official libraries. It was at the Flying University where she understood that it wasn't enough to be a brilliant student. She had to be a cutting-edge scientist. This education in the shadows gave her something that no prestigious university in Europe could offer: the conviction that knowledge is a right worth risking your freedom for. Marie wasn't just learning formulas, she was learning to be a revolutionary of thought. Every night she spent evading Russian patrols to attend a secret lesson was another brick in the construction of that iron will. The very will that years later would keep her standing in front of a boiling cauldron of pitchblende beneath the leaky roof of a Paris shed. Despite all her brilliance and clandestine studies, Marie faced a crushing economic reality. Her father could not afford an education for her abroad. In Poland, the doors were closed, and the only real option was Paris. But the cost of living and the tuition at the Sorbonne were unreachable for a family living on the edge of financial collapse. It was then that Marie and her older sister, Bronislawa, sealed a pact of absolute loyalty that reads like something out of a chivalric novel. They decided they would not try to leave at the same time, because that would mean the failure of both. The plan was simple, but brutally sacrificial. Marie would work for years as a governess to pay for Bronislawa's medical studies in France, and once the older sister graduated and achieved stability, it would be Marie's turn to be supported. Marie, just 18 years old, and with a thirst for science burning deep inside her, set aside her advanced physics books to move to the countryside and work as a private tutor for the children of wealthy families. She spent a large part of this time with the Żurawskis, a family that managed a sugar estate. Imagine the loneliness of a mind like hers, trapped in an environment where the most important topics of conversation were the price of sugar or rural high society gossip. While the children slept, Marie stayed awake until the early morning hours under the dim light of a candle, teaching herself mathematics from treatises her father sent her by mail. In her letters, she confessed that she sometimes felt her brain was rusting, that the lack of contact with other intellectuals was driving her mad. Yet, she never stopped sending every single penny she saved to her sister in Paris. Working as a governess was not only a financial sacrifice, but also a lesson in humility and patience. Marie had to endure the sometimes condescending treatment of her employers, who saw her merely as another employee, never suspecting that the young woman teaching their children the alphabet was one of the most promising minds in Europe. These were years of isolation in which Maria learned to rely on herself and keep the flame of her ambition alive in the absolute desert. Every time she received a letter from Bronislawa telling her about the hospitals of Paris and medical breakthroughs, Marie felt that her effort was worth it. This pact did not just save both of their careers. It forged an economic and emotional resilience in Marie that would be fundamental when years later she had to live on just a few francs a day in a Parisian garret. The success of Marie Curie did not begin in a laboratory with test tubes, but in the solitude of a countryside room, counting coins so her sister could fulfill her dream first. When remembering the life of Marie Curie, it is easy to recall only the cold data and the rigor of her experiments. But before becoming the marble figure we know today, she was a young woman of flesh and blood who suffered an emotional wound that came close to changing the course of history. During her years as a governess on the Żurawski estate, Marie fell in love with Kazimierz, the family's eldest son, a brilliant young man studying mathematics in Warsaw. For Marie, who lived in almost total intellectual isolation, Kazimierz was an oasis. They shared long talks about science and a mutual disdain for the Russian occupation. The feeling was mutual, and they soon began to plan a future together. However, when the Żurawski family learned of the intentions to marry, the harsh reality of social classes fell upon Marie like a bucket of cold water. Even though Marie was an educated young woman from a good family to the Żurawskis, she was still just the help, a governess without a dowry or a fortune. The rejection was humiliating and absolute. Kazimierz, pressured by his parents and fearing the loss of his inheritance or status, was unable to defend his love and chose to break off the engagement. This rejection didn't just break Marie's heart, it plunged her into a deep depression that lasted for months. In her letters from that time, one can sense a woman who had lost hope, who felt trapped in a mediocre destiny, and who even believed that her intellectual life had ended before it had even begun. But it was precisely this emotional failure that ultimately pushed her out of Poland. If she had married Kazimierz, she likely would have stayed in Warsaw, living a comfortable life, but one deeply limited by the restrictions of the era. Finding herself free of those emotional ties, and with the pact with her sister Bronislawa finally bearing fruit, as her sister had now graduated and married in Paris, Maria understood that she had nothing left in her homeland. In 1891, at the age of 24, she made the hardest decision of her life. With the little money she had left, she bought a fourth-class train ticket, packed a trunk with her few dresses and a handful of books, and said goodbye to her father at the Warsaw station. She wasn't going on vacation. She was leaving for a strange land without speaking the language perfectly and in fragile health, but with the determination of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. That train was not just taking her to France. It was pulling her away from the shadows of her past and launching her toward the light of the Sorbonne. The journey from Warsaw to Paris lasted 3 grueling days in fourth-class carriages. She sat on a wooden stool that she had to bring herself to avoid standing the whole way, surrounded by peasants and heavy luggage. When Marie finally stepped off the train at the Gare du Nord in 1891, she did not encounter the romantic city of postcards. Instead, she found a monster of metal, noise, and a frantic pace that overwhelmed her immediately. At that moment, Paris was the center of the universe, the capital of light and progress, a place where freedom was breathed on every corner. But for a young Polish woman who could barely scramble through French, the first contact was a violent cultural shock. She initially moved in with her sister Bronislawa and her brother-in-law, who lived in a neighborhood far from the center. But Marie soon realized that the time she wasted traveling in horse-drawn carriages, combined with the distractions of an active family life, robbed her of precious hours of study. With a determination bordering on stubbornness, she decided to move by herself to the Latin Quarter, the intellectual heart of the city, just a few steps from the Sorbonne. What she sought was not comfort, but an almost monastic solitude that would allow her to absorb all the knowledge that had been denied to her in her own country. She registered at the faculty under the name Marie, the French version of her name, a small gesture that marked the beginning of her new identity. Entering the classrooms of the Sorbonne was like crossing the threshold of a temple for her. Imagine the scene for a second. A slender young woman in a humble, worn dress, sitting in the front rows of immense amphitheaters, surrounded by hundreds of men who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. At the time, out of the thousands of students the university housed, only a handful were women, and nearly all of them were foreigners. French women from good families were still being educated for the tea salon, not the physics laboratory. Marie had no time to feel intimidated. She discovered to her horror that despite her years of self-taught study in Poland, her level of mathematics and physics was far below French standards, and her French was not fluent enough to follow the most complex lessons. Instead of giving up, Marie immersed herself in a work regimen that few human beings could endure. The Latin Quarter, with its bustling cafes and legendary nightlife, was merely a backdrop that she ignored completely as she walked briskly toward the library. She had no interest in the painters of Montmartre or the debates in the cafes of Saint-Germain. Her world had shrunk to blackboards covered in equations and the smell of ozone in the laboratories. She was in the capital of the world, yes, but she lived as if she were in a study cell, convinced that this was her one opportunity to prove that a Polish woman could sit at the table of history's greatest thinkers. It was the beginning of her period of greatest asceticism, a time when physical hunger was nothing but background noise compared to the voracious hunger of her intellect. For Marie, the intellectual freedom of Paris came at a devastating physical cost. Moving into a tiny garret on the 6th floor of a building without an elevator in the Latin Quarter, she began what she herself would later call her years of heroic solitude. The space was barely a cell beneath the roof, suffocatingly hot in the summer and a freezer in the winter. There was no running water, meaning Marie had to carry heavy buckets up the stairs, and the only heat came from a coal stove that she barely ever lit to save every franc. There were nights so freezing that the water would turn to ice in the basin, and Marie had to sleep with all her clothes on, piling the room's single chair on top of her blankets, just so the extra weight would give her a false sense of warmth. Her diet was quite literally one of survival. She lived on tea, bread with butter, and occasionally a couple of eggs or a piece of fruit, which she bought as if it were an absolute luxury. There are records showing that Marie actually fainted right in the university library, not from an illness, but from simple starvation. Her brother-in-law, who was a doctor, had to go find her on one occasion to prescribe a steak and a bit of rest, because her body was on the absolute brink of collapse. Yet, The most astonishing thing is that in her letters and diaries, Marie did not look back on this time with bitterness. On the contrary, she felt a kind of Spartan pride. For her, hunger and cold were minor distractions compared to the glory of being able to study what she wanted. She was so absorbed in her books that the outside world, with its basic biological needs, seemed secondary. This determination was not masochism, it was an absolute priority. If she had to choose between buying coal to keep warm or buying a technical book on optics, the book won every single time. Marie spent 10 to 12 hours a day in the libraries or laboratories of the Sorbonne because at least the environment there was warm and the lighting was free. That miserable garret was the crucible where her character finished forging. If she was capable of enduring 3 years, living on the threshold of extreme poverty, just for the pleasure of solving differential equations, nothing that came after would be able to stop her. Not the physical exhaustion of moving tons of ore, nor the discrimination of her colleagues. Maria was learning to live with the bare minimum, training her will to be invulnerable to any material lack other than the lack of knowledge. By 1893, Marie's Spartan effort began to yield its first academic fruits. She graduated at the top of her class in her physics degree, an achievement that stunned the professors at the Sorbonne, who were not used to seeing a woman, much less a foreigner, outperform all the male students. It was thanks to this outstanding performance that Marie secured her first real research contract. The Society for the Encouragement of National Industry commissioned her to do a technical study on the magnetic properties of different types of steel. It was a project that, although it might seem purely industrial and far removed from the brilliance of radioactivity, proved to be the necessary bridge for her to enter the world of professional experimentation. Her mentor during this period was Gabriel Lippmann, a brilliant scientist who years later would also win the Nobel Prize for his invention of color photography. Lippmann recognized immediately that Marie was not just a brilliant theorist, but a meticulous experimenter, capable of spending hours calibrating instruments with infinite patience. The project consisted of analyzing how the chemical composition of steels affected their magnetization capacity. To carry it out, Marie needed space, heavy machinery, and an infrastructure she completely lacked in her tiny garret or in the crowded laboratories of the university. This research on magnetism was what forced Marie to step out of her shell as a solitary student and begin making contacts in the Parisian scientific world. She spent her days weighing metal samples, measuring magnetic fields, and recording data with a precision that bordered on obsession. It was during this process that Marie realized something fundamental. To do cutting-edge science, intelligence was not enough. You needed a laboratory of your own and precision equipment. And it was precisely this search for a workspace that would lead her, almost by an accident of fate, to meet the man who would change her life forever. Without the magnetism of steels, Marie might never have left the libraries to enter the workshop where destiny was waiting for her. The year 1893 marked Marie's first great triumph in the major leagues of the European intellect. After years of feeding on bread and tea and studying until her eyes burned under candlelight, she sat for her physical sciences degree exams. The result was an academic earthquake for the era. Marie did not just pass, she took first place in her class. Imagine the faces of the examiners and her male peers upon seeing that this quiet, fragile-looking Polish girl had swept them all aside at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. Instead of celebrating and taking a break, Marie returned to Poland that summer with the intention of saving money, but she soon received a scholarship from the Alexandrovich Foundation, destined for outstanding Polish students abroad. With those 600 rubles in her pocket, which to her felt like a fortune, Marie returned to Paris with a goal that bordered on pure ambition: to obtain a second degree, this time in mathematical sciences. If physics was her passion, mathematics was the language necessary to master it. The effort of this second year was just as exhausting. Marie was no longer just fighting against the cold and hunger, but against the accumulated fatigue of years of deprivation. However, her mind seemed to function with a mechanical precision that ignored the weaknesses of the body. In 1894, she achieved her second title, finishing in second place in her class. obtaining 2 degrees in fields so complex in a language that was not her own, and in record time was the ultimate proof that Maria Skolodowska was no ordinary student. She had gone from being a young woman attending clandestine classes in Warsaw to being a double-degree graduate from the Sorbonne. These titles were not just pieces of paper to hang on a wall. They were her coat of arms and her passport to independence. With these credentials in hand, Marie was no longer just an immigrant eager to learn, but a trained scientist seeking a place in the world. And it was precisely this search for a laboratory to continue her studies on steel that put her on a collision course with a young French physicist who shared her same almost religious devotion to science. By 1894, Marie was already a double graduate of the Sorbonne, but she faced a very earthly logistical problem. Her steel samples were too large and heavy, and she did not have a suitable place to set up the magnets and measuring equipment for her research. It was then that a mutual acquaintance, the Polish physicist Józef Kowalski, thought that a young professor at the Municipal School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry of Paris might have a free corner in his laboratory. That man was Pierre Curie. The meeting took place on a spring afternoon at Kowalski's apartment, and what occurred there was not a conventional romantic spark, but something much deeper and stranger. It was the mutual recognition of 2 people who spoke a language that almost no one else on earth understood. Marie remembered Pierre as a tall man with the hands of a worker and a faraway look, typical of those who spend more time in the world of ideas than in social conventions. Pierre was already a respected scientist. At 35, along with his brother Jacques, he had discovered piezoelectricity and formulated fundamental laws about magnetism, but he lived with his back turned to fame and honors. When Marie walked into the room, Pierre was struck, not by her beauty in the traditional sense, but by her seriousness and the technical precision with which she described her laboratory problems. In an era when women were seen as social ornaments, finding a young woman who discussed the structure of matter with the same intensity as he did was, for Pierre, an absolute revelation. The relationship began between test tubes and notebooks. Pierre offered Marie a small space in his laboratory, which was actually a narrow, poorly lit hallway. But for her, it was paradise. They began exchanging books, discussing theories on crystal symmetry, and walking for hours through the streets of Paris, talking exclusively about physics. Pierre, who had always been a convinced loner and had even written in his diary years earlier that women of genius are rare and that love was a distraction for the scientist, found himself deeply in love with Marie's mind. The marriage proposal was not a movie scene, but a battle of wills. Marie, faithful to her Polish idealism, planned to return to Warsaw to live with her father and serve her homeland through teaching. Pierre, desperate at the thought of losing her, went so far as to offer to move to Poland with her, even if it meant abandoning his research and working as a French teacher in any secondary school. That level of sacrifice completely disarmed Marie's armor. She realized that Pierre was not looking for a wife to tend to him, but an intellectual partner, a comrade in arms to face the mysteries of the universe. In the end, their love for science bound them irreversibly. They married in an extremely simple civil ceremony in 1895. There were no rings, no banquet, and no religious blessings. Marie wore a dark blue dress that served her both for the wedding and for working in the laboratory afterward. And their honeymoon consisted of cycling through the French countryside on 2 bicycles bought with money from a wedding gift. 2 solitary minds had collided to form a binary system that would soon illuminate the entire 20th century. To understand the leap into the void that Marie Curie took, we have to place ourselves at a moment in history when science seemed to have reached its end. In the late 19th century, many physicists believed almost everything important had already been discovered. We knew about gravity, the laws of motion, and electromagnetism. The atom was thought to be a solid, indivisible, and eternal sphere, like a tiny billiard ball hiding no further secrets. However, in 1895, an intellectual bomb exploded that no one saw coming. In Germany, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered by pure accident invisible rays capable of passing through paper, wood, and, most shockingly, human flesh, revealing bones on a photographic plate. He called them X-rays because he didn't have the slightest idea what they were. This discovery triggered a global frenzy. Suddenly, the invisible became visible, and matter no longer seemed so solid. Inspired by this finding in Paris, a physicist named Henri Becquerel decided to investigate whether substances that glow in the dark, phosphorescent substances, also emitted these mysterious Röntgen rays. Becquerel took some uranium salts, wrapped them in black paper alongside a photographic plate, and left them in the sun, thinking that sunlight would activate the emission. But this is where chance plays its part in the history of science. For several days in February 1896, the Paris sky was grey and overcast. A frustrated Becquerel stored the uranium salts and photographic plates in a dark drawer, waiting for the sun to come out. A few days later, on a hunch or out of simple laboratory routine, he decided to develop the plates that had been kept in total darkness. What he saw left him cold. The plates were fogged with an intense, clear silhouette of the uranium salts. This meant something revolutionary and terrifying for the physics of the era. Uranium emitted energy spontaneously, without needing to be activated by sunlight, heat, or any external source. Uranium simply radiated energy on its own, incessantly and for no apparent reason. It was an accidental discovery that most scientists of the time ignored because they were too busy playing with the spectacular X-rays, which were much easier to see and sell to the public. Becquerel himself dubbed this phenomenon uranic rays, and shortly afterward stopped investigating them because he couldn't find a logical explanation and thought they were a dead end. While the scientific community looked the other way, Marie Curie, who had just had her first daughter, Irene, and was looking for a topic for her doctoral thesis, set her eyes on those forgotten rays of Becquerel. While everyone was dazzled by photographs of bones, Marie intuited that in that strange energy bursting from uranium in the darkness of a drawer, the deepest secret of matter lay hidden. No one knew where that energy came from, and according to the laws of physics at the time, it was impossible because it violated the principle of conservation of energy. Marie decided she was going to measure those rays with a precision Becquerel never had, and in that process, she was about to shatter the atom and change the world forever. In 1897, Marie Curie stood at a crossroads that would define not only her career, but the future of modern science. She had just become a mother to her first daughter, Irene, and instead of settling for domestic life or a high school teaching position, she decided she wanted to reach the academic pinnacle, a doctorate in science. At that time, no woman in the world had obtained a doctorate from the Sorbonne, and the few who had tried in other countries usually chose descriptive or less risky topics. Marie, true to her instinct to always seek the hardest path, focused her attention on a phenomenon the scientific community had quickly brushed aside: the mysterious rays Becquerel found emitted by uranium. The choice was one of absolute audacity. While most of Europe's physicists were obsessed with X-rays, which had immediate and spectacular medical applications, Marie saw a fundamental enigma in uranium. Where did uranium get the energy to emit these rays constantly, without exhausting itself and without needing an external source? According to the laws of physics known at the time, that was simply impossible. It was as if a lamp shone forever without being plugged into the current and without burning fuel. Marie intuited that this was not a common chemical reaction, but something occurring deep within the interior of matter, something no one had named yet. Pierre, who was already a global expert in measuring subtle electrical forces, understood immediately the magnitude of what Marie wanted to investigate. Instead of using Becquerel's photographic plates, which gave imprecise and slow results, Marie decided to use an invention of Pierre and his brother Jacques, the piezoelectric quartz electrometer. This apparatus was a masterpiece of precision that allowed for the measurement of incredibly weak electrical currents in the air around uranium samples. Marie was not going to settle for seeing smudges on a plate. She was going to quantify the energy. Her starting hypothesis was revolutionary in its simplicity. She wanted to know if other substances, besides uranium, possessed this property. With infinite patience, She began systematically testing all chemical elements known to date, one by one, like someone looking for a needle in a cosmic haystack. This decision marked the transition from classical physics to nuclear physics. Marie was not simply choosing a topic to graduate. She was choosing to interrogate the atom in its own language. What started as a technical study for a doctoral thesis quickly transformed into a scientific hunt that would lead her to discover that uranium was not an isolated case, but the gateway to a completely unknown continent of nature. To carry out an investigation that would change the course of humanity, one would expect to find Marie Curie in a sanctuary of science, surrounded by fine glassware and cutting-edge technology. But the reality was much harsher, and at the same time, more epic. Because Marie was not an established professor, and her thesis topic was considered exotic, the Sorbonne did not assign her a real budget or a proper space. The only place Pierre could secure for her was an old shed at the School of Physics and Chemistry that had previously been used as a dissection room for the Faculty of Medicine. It was, in the words of scientists who visited it later, a cross between a stable and an abandoned basement. The shed had a glass roof that leaked every time it rained and an asphalt floor that cracked over time. It had no heating, which meant that during Parisian winters, the temperature dropped so low that Marie could barely hold the delicate precision instruments with her frozen fingers. In summer, the place became a suffocating oven without any ventilation. The most ironic part is that Marie needed ventilation not for her comfort, but because she was handling substances that filled the air with unknown gases. She worked in an environment where mineral dust floated everywhere, covering her notebooks and clothes with an invisible patina that, as we know today, was pure radioactive poison. Despite these deplorable conditions, Marie would recall this period years later as one of the happiest of her life. There is something crazy and mystical about that image. A brilliant woman dressed in a laboratory apron stained with acid, stirring heavy cauldrons full of boiling ore with an iron rod while the smoke enveloped her. Pierre, seeing the magnitude of the work and the astonishing results Marie was starting to get, decided to abandon his own research on crystals to join her in that shed. Together, they turned that miserable place into the center of the scientific world. The shed was so precarious that Pierre's precision instruments, designed to measure minuscule electrical currents, constantly went out of calibration due to the humidity and temperature changes. Marie had to fight not only against the mystery of matter, but against the basic physics of her environment. However, in that space where others only saw rubble and dampness, she saw the possibility of uncovering secrets the universe had kept for billions of years. That improvised laboratory is proof that genius does not need marble or gold. It only needs an unyielding will and a place where the rain cannot put out the fire of curiosity. As Marie advanced in her research, she ran into a logical wall that would have made any other scientist doubt. Following her rigorous method, she began measuring the intensity of radiation, not just in pure uranium, but in various minerals that contained it. It was then that pitchblende came into her hands, a dark, heavy, resinous-looking mineral mined from Joachimsthal in what is now the Czech Republic. Marie placed a sample in her precision electrometer, and what she saw left her bewildered. Pitchblende was much more active than pure uranium. In fact, it was 4 times more powerful than mathematical calculations predicted. This was an absolute scientific impossibility. According to what was known up to that point, if uranium was responsible for the radiation, the raw mineral should be less active than the pure element, since in the stone, uranium is mixed with other inert sediments that emit nothing. It was like weighing a jar with 10 cookies and finding the total weight was greater than that of the cookies and the jar combined. Marie repeated the experiment once, 10 times, 100 times. She cleaned the instruments, changed the samples, and recalibrated Pierre's electrometer. But the result was always the same. Pitchblende vibrated with an energy that could not be explained simply by the uranium it contained. In that moment of doubt, Marie had a flash of genius that we consider the cornerstone of modern physics today. Instead of thinking her instruments were failing, she dared to propose a bold hypothesis. If pitchblende is more active than uranium, it must be because hidden inside that dark stone is a new substance, an unknown chemical element that is immensely more powerful than uranium. But there was a problem. She had already analyzed all the elements on the periodic table. Therefore, what she was looking for was something humanity had not yet discovered. Something present in pitchblende in quantities so minuscule that no one had ever noticed it. This intuition transformed Marie's research from a simple physical study into a true chemical hunt of titanic dimensions. She and Pierre understood that this new element must be present in proportions of barely 1/1,000,000th part of the mineral. To find it, they would have to process mountains of rock to extract a pinch of invisible powder. Pierre, fascinated by his wife's flawless logic, decided to permanently abandon his own projects to help her unravel this mystery. They weren't looking for a new property of matter. They were looking for a new inhabitant of the universe. Pitchblende ceased to be a simple stone and became the chest holding a secret that would change our understanding of the atom forever. By July 1898, work in the shed on Rue Lomond had become frantic. Marie and Pierre had achieved something that seemed impossible. Through an extremely meticulous process of chemical separation, they discarded the known components of pitchblende until they were left with a residue that was 400 times more active than uranium. It was not a matter of luck. Marie applied a chemical fractioning method where she dissolved the mineral in acids and then precipitated the different elements to measure their activity. Every time she managed to concentrate that mysterious substance, Pierre's electrometer went wild, marking energy levels that defied all previous logic. Finally, Marie had absolute certainty that she had found a new chemical element. But instead of naming it with a pompous name derived from Greek or Latin, as dictated by the scientific tradition of the era, she decided to turn her discovery into an act of political rebellion. She called it polonium. This name was not a random choice. It was a cry of protest launched from the heart of Paris toward the Russian Empire. By naming the new element in honor of her homeland, Poland, Marie was using science to give visibility to a country that had been erased from official maps. It was her way of saying that although Poland was occupied and its language persecuted, its name would remain engraved forever on the periodic table, in the very structure of matter. The discovery of polonium was received with a mixture of astonishment and skepticism by the scientific community. It was a strange element with a short half-life, making it difficult to study compared to uranium. But for Marie, polonium was proof that her instinct had not failed her. However, the glow of polonium was only the prologue. During the isolation process, they realized that after extracting the polonium, the liquid waste left in the cauldrons remained immensely radioactive. This meant that pitchblende hid not one, but two new elements. Polonium had been the first striking blow, but what was to come was something that would completely eclipse everything known up to that moment. If polonium had been an astonishing discovery, what Marie and Pierre discovered in December 1898 was something bordering on the supernatural. As they continued to analyze the residues of pitchblende, they realized there was another invisible substance, one that was even more potent and persistent than polonium. They named it radium, from the Latin radius, meaning ray. This name was a declaration of intent. They had found the purest source of that energy Marie had already officially baptized as radioactivity. Radium was not simply a new element. It was a force of nature that seemed to possess its own light. Literally, radium glowed. Marie and Pierre used to return to the shed at night, in total darkness, just to stand in silence, observing the silhouettes of the glass jars containing their samples. What they saw was a pale, bluish glow, a phantasmal light that seemed suspended in the air. Marie described these containers as fireflies trapped in glass. At that time, this luminescence felt beautiful and magical to them. They had no way of knowing that this glow was actually the warning sign of a release of energy so violent that it was destroying the surrounding air, and in the process, irreversibly damaging their own bodies. The official announcement of radium before the Paris Academy of Sciences was a moment of total rupture with the chemistry of the past. Marie presented an element that was 900 times more radioactive than uranium. But what was most disturbing to the scientists of the era was that radium challenged the notion that the atom was something dead and immutable. Radium was alive in the sense that it changed, it emitted heat and light constantly, without anything appearing to deplete it. In the minds of many, it was the realization of the ancient alchemist's dream, a substance containing a practically infinite internal source of energy. However, the announcement was only the beginning of a physical ordeal. The Curies had proven that radium existed through the electrical signals it emitted, but to the more conservative community of chemists, an element did not truly exist until you could see it, weigh it, and touch it in its pure form. Radium was present in pitchblende in such ridiculously small quantities that to obtain just a gram of pure radium salts, Marie would have to face a task that defied all human logic. Radium had been announced to the world, but now Marie would have to extract it from the bowels of the earth, gram by gram, in a 4-year struggle that would test the very limits of her existence. Following the announcement of radium's discovery, Marie and Pierre faced an academic skepticism bordering on mockery. For the old guard chemists, if you couldn't place the element on a scale and determine its atomic weight, the element simply did not exist. It was a physicist's fantasy. Marie, far from being discouraged, accepted the challenge, but to achieve it, she needed a massive amount of raw material. Thanks to her contacts, she managed to get the Austrian government to grant her several tons of pitchblende residue from the Joachimsthal mines. This residue was basically waste, crushed rock from which uranium had already been extracted to manufacture glass. But to the Curies, it contained the greatest treasure in the world. When the heavy sacks of dust and pine needles arrived at the shed on Rue Lomond, what can only be described as voluntary forced labor began. Imagine this woman, who was already one of the most brilliant minds of her century, dressed in a thick leather apron, moving heavy iron cauldrons filled with boiling liquid and sediment. For 4 years, the laboratory was not a place of quiet reflection, but an infernal foundry. Marie spent entire days stirring the thick mass with an iron rod that was nearly as tall as she was, inhaling corrosive vapors and smoke that burned her eyes and throat. The effort was so physical that at the end of the day, she would literally collapse from exhaustion, her hands cracked and filled with sores that never fully healed. The process was an obsessive purification. From each ton of material, Marie had to gradually reduce the quantity through successive crystallizations, eliminating impurities until she was left with a few grains of sand that glowed in the dark. She did this in a place where dust flew freely, where drafts cooled the containers prematurely, and where rain leaked through the roof, sometimes ruining weeks of work. Pierre took charge of the electrical measurements, but the heavy alchemical work fell primarily on Marie. There were no safety protocols because no one knew what they were up against. She handled radium with her bare hands, kept it in the pockets of her dress, and left it on her nightstands. While she fought against tons of rock to extract a phantom, her body absorbed doses of radiation that would have killed any other human being in a matter of months. But Marie did not feel the danger. She felt the intoxication of discovery. In those years of titanic effort, she went from processing sacks of earth to obtaining her first decigram of pure radium chloride. She had conquered matter through sheer exhaustion, proving that her will was heavier and more resilient than the tons of debris she had to move to change the history of science. By 1902, after nearly 4 years of physical punishment and having breathed in more toxic vapors than any industrial factory worker of the era, Marie Curie achieved what seemed like an alchemist's fantasy. Out of the several tons of pitchblende residue that had passed through her cauldrons, she was finally able to isolate a minuscule amount, barely 1/10 of a gram of pure radium chloride. It was a ridiculous amount when considering the titanic effort it took to secure, but to science, it was a treasure more valuable than all the gold in the Bank of France. With that small sample of white powder glowing with a hypnotic bluish light in the twilight of the laboratory, Marie prepared to perform the trial by fire. determining its atomic weight. This was the moment of truth against the most skeptical chemists in Europe, those who refused to believe in the existence of an element that could not be weighed with precision. Marie utilized extremely rigorous quantitative analysis methods, performing successive weighings on a precision balance that demanded the pulse of a surgeon and infinite patience. Each time she purified the sample through fractional crystallizations, the number on the scale became clearer. Finally, she was able to announce to the world that the atomic weight of radium was 225. It was a strike of unprecedented scientific authority. Radium was no longer a phantom detected by electrical apparatuses. Now, it had an official identity document, an irrefutable place on Mendeleev's periodic table. The precision of Marie's work was so astonishing that the values she obtained over a century ago barely differ from those we know today using satellite and digital technology. By fixing that number, Marie did not just baptize an element, she validated her entire theory of radioactivity. She proved that radium was a new chemical element, with chemical properties similar to barium, but with a completely terrifying and fascinating physical personality. This scientific victory finally silenced her critics and placed her name on the list of candidates for science's highest honor. Marie had gone from being a Polish student with a strange idea to being the woman who had forced matter to reveal one of its most jealously guarded secrets. Despite the fact that Marie's work had been the driving engine behind the discoveries of radioactivity, the academic power structure of the early 20th century was designed for women to be, at best, invisible assistants. In 1903, the Swedish Academy of Sciences decided that the Nobel Prize in Physics should be awarded to Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie. In the original nomination document, Marie Curie's name was deliberately omitted. For the academics of the time, the idea that a woman could be the intellectual force behind a physical revolution was simply inconceivable. They assumed she was merely an enthusiastic helper who cleaned her husband's test tubes. The injustice was flagrant. It was Marie who had the original intuition regarding the atomic nature of radiation. It was she who isolated polonium, and it was she who spent 4 years stirring cauldrons of pitchblende to prove the existence of radium. Yet, the Swedish committee preferred a narrative where male genius led and the wife accompanied. If history had stayed that way, Marie Curie would have gone down to posterity as a footnote in Pierre's biography, a blurry shadow behind a great man. But destiny, and above all Pierre Curie's integrity, intervened. A member of the Nobel Committee who supported equal merit, the mathematician Magnus Gösta Mittag-Leffler, wrote a private letter to Pierre warning him of the situation. Pierre's response was immediate and uncompromising. Far from being seduced by the ego of receiving the award alone, Pierre wrote to the Academy demanding that his wife be included. He declared that if he were to be granted an award for their research on radioactivity, it would be an artistic and scientific incoherence for Marie not to be at his side, given that her role in the discoveries had been equal to, or even greater than his own. Thanks to this pressure and the irrefutable evidence of their joint publications, the Swedish Academy had to yield. Marie Curie thus became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. However, institutional disdain was so persistent that neither of them could attend the official ceremony due to health problems derived precisely from their work with radium. Even so, the blow had been struck. Marie had shattered the glass ceiling of world science, even if she had to enter the pantheon of great names holding her husband's hand, because the world was not yet ready to see her walk alone. The greatness of Pierre Curie lay not only in his ability to measure the invisible forces of the universe, but in an ethical integrity that was, at the time, almost as rare as radium itself. When he received the confidential news that the Swedish Academy planned to award the Nobel Prize in Physics only to him and Henri Becquerel, Pierre did not feel flattered. He felt deeply insulted in his scientific rigor. He knew better than anyone that Marie was not his assistant, nor his muse, nor a simple technical collaborator. Marie was the intellectual strategist, the one who had formulated the hypothesis that radioactivity was an atomic property, and the one who had executed the physical and chemical effort necessary to prove it. Without hesitating for a single second, Pierre drafted a reply that is today legendary in the annals of science. In a letter addressed to Mittag Leffler, he made it clear that he would not accept a recognition that erased Marie's authorship. Pierre argued with mathematical coldness that his research on radioactive phenomena was so intrinsically linked to that of his wife that separating their names was an act of academic falsehood. It was a gesture of absolute nobility, especially in an era when it was normal for laboratory directors to appropriate the work of their subordinates, and much more so if those subordinates were women. This defense was not just an act of romantic love, but an act of professional justice. Pierre forced the Swedish Academy to review its own statutes and to recognize that Marie's work met all requirements of originality and excellence. Thanks to his firmness, the committee had to back down and modify the nomination to officially include her. In doing so, Pierre not only secured Marie's place in history, but set a precedent that would begin to crack the misogynistic structures of European universities. That 1903 Nobel Prize, ultimately awarded to both for their joint research on radiation phenomena, was a shared triumph, but it was also the first time the scientific world had to admit, even if grudgingly, that genius has no gender. Pierre's intervention saved science from committing one of its greatest mistakes, and allowed Marie to present herself to the planet, not as the wife of a scientist, but as a scientist in her own right, whose light was as much her own, and as powerful as that of the element she herself had baptized. While the Curies' names rose like wildfire in academic circles, their bodies began to emit distress signals that they, in their obsession with work, decided to categorize as mere occupational hazards. By 1903, Marie and Pierre were no longer the vigorous young people who toured France on bicycles. Both suffered from a chronic fatigue that forced them to spend entire days in bed, something they attributed to nervous exhaustion from the titanic effort in the shed. However, what was truly occurring was that the millions of alpha and beta particles emanating from their samples were bombarding their cells, breaking their DNA strands, and altering their blood composition in a silent but implacable manner. One of the most evident and painful signs appeared on their hands. Marie noticed that her fingertips became hard and cracked, and that the skin peeled continuously, revealing raw flesh that took weeks to heal. Pierre, for his part, performed an experiment that today would seem like suicidal madness. He placed a sample of radium on his arm for 10 hours to observe the reaction. The result was a deep burn that took months to heal and left a permanent scar. Instead of being frightened, Pierre wrote a detailed report on the physiological action of radium. He was marveled by the substance's power to destroy living tissue, seeing in that horror the seed of what we know today as radiotherapy to destroy tumors. But the damage was not just superficial. Marie began to suffer episodes of severe anemia and vision problems that would accompany her for the rest of her days. Pierre suffered joint pains so acute that he would sometimes scream in pain in the middle of the night, which the doctors of the era erroneously diagnosed as rheumatism. Here is the English translation of the text, continuing the narrative and dramatic tone while maintaining accuracy and correcting typos from the original transcript, such as Wardis to Dr. Eugene Curie / grandfather, Eve to Eve, etc. What they did not know was that radium is a bone seeker. The body mistakes it for calcium and deposits it directly into the skeleton, where it continues to emit radiation from the inside out, destroying the bone marrow. Despite the sores, the pain, and the exhaustion, the Curies never established a real link between their ailments and the substance they so deeply loved. To them, radium was their creation, their light in the darkness, and they could not conceive that their scientific child could be the executioner consuming them. Even when Marie noticed that the laboratory air caused her a persistent cough and eye irritation, she would simply open a window and keep working. They were so fascinated by the glow beside them in their test tubes that they did not realize this brightness was actually the invisible fire that was extinguishing their lives. By the beginning of the 20th century, radium had become the most expensive and coveted substance on the planet. Doctors all over the world were beginning to report that radiation could destroy malignant tumors, and suddenly, What had been born in a damp shed was transformed into $1 million industry. Marie and Pierre found themselves facing a decision that could have changed their family's financial destiny forever. They held the secret to the radium purification process in their hands. If they chose to patent that method, they would have become billionaires overnight, securing a life of luxury for themselves and a colossal inheritance for their daughters. However, one night in 1903, the two sat down to discuss the future of their discovery. Marie remembered that conversation with absolute clarity. Pierre presented the two options. The first was to declare themselves the owners of the process and charge for every gram of radium produced in the world. The second was to publish every detail of their research without reservation, allowing any scientist or company to use their method free of charge. For Marie, the answer did not require a single second of hesitation. She fervently believed that science should stand above personal interests, and that radium, being an element of nature intended to heal the sick, could not belong to anyone. This decision was an act of almost mystical ethics. They decided that patenting radium would be contrary to the scientific spirit. Instead of protecting their secret, they published the extraction process, step by step, even answering letters from American engineers who wanted to set up radium factories in the United States to profit from it. The Curies asked for nothing in return, while corporations grew rich and the price of radium skyrocketed to astronomical levels. Marie and Pierre continued to live with just enough, working in the same precarious laboratory and struggling to make ends meet. Many years later, when Marie visited the United States and realized that her own laboratory did not have enough radium for research because it was too expensive to buy, someone asked her if she regretted not patenting the process. Her response was definitive. She said that humanity needs practical men who get the most out of their work, but it also needs dreamers for whom the development of a task is so captivating that it is impossible for them to dedicate their care to their own material benefit. For Marie, science was a common good, a heritage of humanity, and she preferred to die as an immigrant with burned fingers rather than a wealthy businesswoman who had put a price tag on the progress of medicine. Although Marie Curie's public image is usually that of an austere, almost monastic scientist, between 1904 and 1906, her private life was going through a period of unusual warmth. The Curies had formed a home that operated under very different rules than those of the Parisian bourgeoisie of the era. In 1897, Irene was born, a girl who from her earliest years showed a seriousness and a capacity for concentration that looked suspiciously like her mother's. 7 years later, in 1904, little Eve arrived, who, unlike the rest of the family, would develop an artistic personality, eventually becoming a brilliant pianist and her mother's future biographer. Faithful to her Polish upbringing, Marie applied the same principles of discipline and love for nature to raising her daughters that she herself had received. She was not a mother who showered her daughters with expensive toys or pompous dresses. For her, play meant physical exercise and learning outdoors. She installed a gymnasium in the garden of their house and ensured that the girls practiced swimming, horseback riding, and Swedish gymnastics every day, regardless of the weather. Marie wanted her daughters to be strong in both mind and body, so they could face a world that remained hostile toward women. The dynamics in the house were curious. While Marie and Pierre spent most of the day in the laboratory, grandfather Eugène, Pierre's father, took charge of the girls' daily education. It was he who taught them to love botany and history, while their parents tried to balance the global fame the Nobel Prize had brought them with domestic life. However, not everything was harmony. Marie lived tormented by the guilt of not spending enough time with her daughters due to her research, and in her personal diaries there are annotations where she recorded with scientific precision each of the girls' milestones, their weight, their first words, the cutting of their teeth. Even in motherhood, Marie could not help but be a meticulous observer. Eve would recall years later that in their house they did not talk about money or honors, but about science, travels, and ideals. It was a home where intelligence was breathed in the air, but where the weight of the parents' exhaustion was also felt. Often, silence reigned at dinner because Marie and Pierre were too tired to speak. With their hands bandaged from radium burns, yet surrounded by their daughters, they seemed to have found a fragile balance between the atom and affection. It was a period of contained domestic happiness, a brief calm before the most devastating tragedy knocked on their door and changed the course of their lives forever. That Thursday in April dawned with a grey sky and a persistent rain that soaked the streets of Paris, turning the pavement into a slippery and dangerous surface. Pierre Curie, who by then was a global celebrity and a professor at the Sorbonne, left a faculty meeting and set out to cross Rue Dauphine, a narrow and congested street near the Pont Neuf. Pierre walked in a daze, probably lost in his thoughts regarding the structure of matter, with his umbrella open to protect himself from the downpour. It was in that instant of distraction that destiny decided to cut short one of the most brilliant minds in history. Attempting to cross the street, Pierre did not notice that a heavy, horse-drawn transport wagon, loaded with several tons of military uniforms, was heading toward him at high speed. The physicist tried to dodge the carriage, but he slipped on the wet asphalt and fell directly under the wheels of the heavy cart. Although the driver desperately attempted to brake, it was futile. One of the rear wheels of the wagon passed exactly over Pierre's head, causing instant death. In a single second, the man who had deciphered the secrets of magnetism and radioactivity became just another victim of chaotic Parisian traffic. He was only 46 years old. The news spread through Paris like an electric shock. When the police arrived at the Curies' home to report what had happened, Marie was not there. Upon returning and encountering the news, her reaction was a frigid, terrifying silence. She did not scream. She did not cry in front of strangers. She simply froze as if her own atomic structure had turned to ice. Pierre's body was brought to the family home, and Marie spent hours sitting beside him, caressing his face and speaking to him in whispers, as if she could awaken him through the strength of her will. This accident was not just a personal tragedy. It was a national mourning. France lost its most beloved scientist, and Marie lost not only her husband and the father of her daughters, but her only intellectual partner, the only person in the world who truly understood the magnitude of her ambition. From that day forward, Marie Curie would never be the same. The blue glow of radium that they had loved so much together now seemed like a cold light illuminating an empty house. The woman in black was truly born on that rainy afternoon on Rue Dauphine, carrying from then on a mourning that would accompany her until her final breath. Following Pierre's death, Marie entered a state of emotional paralysis that frightened even her closest friends. To the outside world, she was a figure of marble, a scientist who returned to the laboratory just a few weeks after the burial with an almost inhuman coldness. But the reality was that Marie was breaking apart inside. Unable to speak of her grief with others, she began to keep an intimate diary, addressed exclusively to her deceased husband. These pages, which remained hidden for decades, reveal a woman walking along the edge of the abyss, using writing as a final thread of connection to the man she loved. In this diary, Marie speaks to Pierre as if he were in the next room, describing the void of his absence with heartbreaking detail. She tells him how it feels to walk through the laboratory corridors without hearing his footsteps, and how the smell of ozone and acids constantly reminds her of the afternoons they spent together over the cauldrons. In one of the rawest entries, Marie describes the moment she was handed the clothes Pierre was wearing on the day of the accident. In a burst of despair and macabre love, she cut pieces of the blood-stained fabric to keep as relics before burning the rest in the fireplace, so no one else could touch them. It was the reaction of a scientific mind confronted with the absolute lack of logic in death. This mourning was not brief. Marie spent months living in a sort of trance where her only motivation to keep breathing was her daughters and the continuation of the work they had both started. In the diary, she promises Pierre that she will not let the radium stop, that she will carry the burden for both of them. This private writing shows us the true Marie, a woman who, behind her facade of austerity and rigor, possessed a volcanic sensitivity. The diary became her confessional, the place where she allowed herself to weep and confess that she felt like a stranger in a world that no longer made sense without her companion. It was through this private grieving process that Marie managed to transmute her sadness into an even fiercer work ethic, turning her loneliness into the fuel necessary to face the most productive and difficult years of her career. Following the tragedy, the University of Paris found itself facing an unprecedented institutional dilemma. Pierre Curie occupied a chair created specifically for him, and the logic of the era dictated that this position should be inherited by another renowned male scientist. However, in a gesture of poetic justice and recognition of merit, the faculty council made a revolutionary decision. They offered Marie her husband's chair. They did not do it out of charity, but because there was no one else in the world who knew as much about radioactivity as she did. On May 1st, 1906, Marie Curie was appointed professor, becoming the first woman in history to hold a high-level teaching position in the 650-year existence of the Sorbonne. On November 5th of that same year, at 1:30 in the afternoon, an event occurred that paralyzed the intellectual society of France. The faculty amphitheater was overflowing. There were not only students, but also journalists, aristocrats, and onlookers who had gathered to witness what they considered a social spectacle, a woman giving a university lecture. The atmosphere was charged with electric tension. Many expected Marie to begin her speech with words of gratitude to the government, or with an emotional tribute to her late husband, following the social conventions of mourning. But Marie Curie was not a woman of conventions. She entered the classroom dressed in strict black, pale, and with her gaze fixed on the floor. A deathly silence fell as she approached the podium. Without raising her voice, and without a single mention of her personal tragedy, Marie began her lecture exactly at the same point where Pierre had left off in his final class. Her first words were a technical continuation regarding the theory of ions in gases. It was an act of devastating elegance and intellectual strength. With that gesture, Marie told everyone that she was not there as a widow protected by the system, but as a professional scientist guaranteeing the continuity of knowledge. That class marked a turning point in the history of education. Marie proved that science has neither feelings nor gender, only rigor. Despite the murmurs of those who viewed her as an intruder, her mastery of the subject was so absolute that at the end of the lesson, the auditorium erupted into a closed round of applause. Marie Curie had taken possession of her place in the world, not just as Pierre's successor, but as the absolute master of a new discipline. The Sorbonne would never again be an exclusive men's club, and Marie, though heartbroken, had become the teacher of a new generation of physicists who would look upon her with a respect bordering on devotion. By 1909, Marie Curie was no longer just a professor at the Sorbonne, but a global symbol of science. However, she continued to work under conditions that were a shame to the prestige of France. The old shed on Rue Lomond could give no more, and Marie, with her characteristic determination, issued an ultimatum to the authorities. Either they gave her a laboratory worthy of a scientific power, or she would leave for the Pasteur Institute, or even out of the country. The pressure took effect, and in a joint effort between the University of Paris and the Pasteur Institute, the creation of a cutting-edge research center was approved, the Radium Institute. This project was not simply a brick building. It was the materialization of the dream she and Pierre had sketched during their long night walks. Marie was involved in every detail of the construction, from the layout of the drains for chemical waste to the choice of trees for the garden. She insisted that researchers needed greenery and natural light to relieve the tension of working with such dangerous substances. The institute was designed with two fundamental pavilions: the Curie Pavilion, dedicated to physical and chemical research, and the Pasteur Pavilion, focused on medical applications and the fight against cancer. As the walls of the institute rose, Marie consolidated her working method. She was not just looking for results. She was looking to train a new breed of scientists. The Radium Institute became a sort of independent nation within Paris, where students from all over the world, many of them Polish and many of them women, arrived, drawn by the legend of the woman in black. Marie governed this space with a blend of military discipline and maternal devotion. She knew every experiment being conducted and personally supervised safety measures, even as she herself continued to ignore basic protocols regarding her own health. The completion of this work represented Marie's definitive victory over the precariousness of her beginnings. The Radium Institute not only ensured that France would be the epicenter of nuclear physics for decades, but it also established an interdisciplinary research model that seems normal to us today, but was revolutionary in 1910. Marie had succeeded in giving radium a temple worthy of its stature, a place where the energy she had discovered could be studied, tamed, and put at the service of medicine. The shed was left behind. Now, the Curies' science had an eternal home. At the end of 1910, Marie found herself at the peak of her professional career, but also at a point of absolute physical and mental exhaustion. For years, radioactivity had been the hottest topic in global science. Yet all knowledge regarding this new discipline was scattered across hundreds of articles, laboratory notes, and isolated lectures. The scientific community was confused because discoveries were happening at a speed no one could process. In this context, Marie decided it was time to bring order to the chaos and embarked on the titanic task of writing a definitive work to serve as the Bible of this new era. The result was the Treatise on Radioactivity, a monumental 2-volume work of more than 1,000 pages that became the cornerstone of modern nuclear physics. To understand the magnitude of this effort, one must visualize Marie sitting at her desk for hours on end, surrounded by her own radium-stained notebooks and the notes Pierre had left behind before he died. It was not simply a matter of compiling information, but of creating a new language. In these pages, she systematized every detail humanity knew about radium, polonium, and uranium. She explained with mathematical precision how atoms, believed to be immutable since the time of the ancient Greeks, could actually fall apart and transform into something different. It was as if a cartographer were drawing the map of a continent that had just emerged from the ocean. Marie was defining the rules of a game no one knew existed. The treatise was not just a textbook for students, it was a manifesto of scientific rigor. In it, Marie documented her 4 years of struggle against tons of pitchblende, detailing the chemical fractionation processes with a meticulousness that allowed any laboratory in the world to repeat her experiments. This is fundamental because in science, truth only exists if it can be replicated. By publishing her methods so openly, Marie was democratizing the atom. Furthermore, the book included profound reflections on energy. Marie theorized on the fact that radium emitted heat constantly, an observation that challenged the principle of conservation of energy as it was understood in the 19th century. She correctly intuited that this energy did not come from the outside, but from an immense reserve hidden in the very heart of matter. The most fascinating part of this period is that while she was writing these lines that would change history, her health was in tatters. Her fingers, hardened by burns, could barely hold the pen, and her eyesight was beginning to fail due to cataracts caused by radiation. Yet her obsession with precision pushed her to check every figure over and over again. The treatise on radioactivity was her great gift to the world of knowledge, a work that allowed physics to transition from the study of solid bodies to the study of invisible and subatomic forces. It was in many ways her intellectual testament shared with Pierre, a way of telling the world that their work had not been a series of fortunate accidents, but a cathedral of logic built gram by gram. In the year 1911, while Marie Curie was preparing to attend the most important conferences of her life, a meteor storm of biblical proportions was about to break over her head. 4 years after Pierre's death, Marie had begun a romantic relationship with Paul Langevin, a former student of her husband and one of the most brilliant physicists in France. Langevin was a brilliant man, but he was trapped in a deeply unhappy and violent marriage to a woman who did not understand his world. The problem was not just the romance itself, but that in the conservative France of the early 20th century, Marie was still viewed as a foreigner, a Polish woman who came to take jobs, and now, according to the press, to destroy French homes. It all began when Langevin's wife managed to get hold of private letters that Marie and Paul had exchanged. Instead of resolving the matter in the privacy of a courtroom, the letters were delivered to the tabloid newspapers of Paris. which at the time were experts in the art of media lynching. Newspapers like Le Journal published incendiary headlines presenting Marie not as the scientific eminence she was, but as a foreign predator, a woman who used her charms to steal the husband of a devoted French mother. The tone of the press was of a cruelty difficult to imagine. Stories were invented, encounters were exaggerated, and it was even suggested that the romance had begun before Pierre died. This was an absolute slander designed to destroy the reputation of the most respected woman in science. The situation became so violent that an angry mob surrounded Marie's house in Sceaux. People shouted insults, threw stones at the windows, and demanded that the foreigner leave France. Marie had to flee her own home with her daughters Irene and Eve to take refuge in the house of close friends like the Perrins. It was a brutal shock for a woman who had always lived for the laboratory and for silence. Overnight, the Nobel Prize winner went from being a national pride to being treated as a moral criminal. Paul Langevin, for his part, found himself entangled in duels of honor with journalists to try to clear Marie's name, but the damage was already done. What the press was doing was a massive distraction campaign. Instead of discussing her discoveries or her chair at the Sorbonne, the entire country was debating her feelings and her private life. This stage of her life shows us the darkest face of fame. Marie discovered that the society that had applauded her for isolating radium was the same one ready to trample her for seeking a bit of companionship in her loneliness. The Langevin scandal was not just bedroom gossip. It was a pitched battle between science and prejudice, between a woman claiming her right to happiness and a system that only accepted her as long as she remained a submissive and silent widow. This media harassment almost achieved what radiation could not, breaking the spirit of Marie Curie. The scandal surrounding Marie Curie was not simply a matter of matrimonial morality. It uncovered one of the darkest and most festering veins of French society at the time. For the most nationalist and far-right sectors, represented by newspapers like l'Action Française, Marie was the perfect target. They did not see her as the illustrious citizen who had honored France with a Nobel Prize, but as an intruder. Opinion pieces used hate-filled language, constantly referring to her as the Polish woman, or, worse yet, the Jewish woman. Despite the fact that Marie was not Jewish, the objective was clear: strip her of her scientific identity and reduce her to a foreign threat coming to corrupt the sacred values of the French family. This smear campaign was an exercise in systematic misogyny. While Paul Langevin was viewed by many as a man who had simply succumbed to temptation, Marie was painted as a cold and calculating seductress. The logic of that time dictated that a woman dedicated to science could not have normal feelings, and if she did, they must necessarily be perverse. It was said that her intelligence was an anomaly, and that her ambition in the laboratory was the same tool she used to manipulate men. It was the modern-day narrative of the wise woman as a witch. Journalists had no mercy, writing entire paragraphs questioning how a mother could spend so much time among professors while simultaneously having an affair, suggesting she neglected her daughters while desecrating the memory of Pierre Curie. The attack was so well coordinated that even colleagues from the Academy of Sciences, who already felt resentment that a woman occupied a chair at the Sorbonne, used the scandal to try to displace her. It was whispered that a woman of such questionable morals could not represent the institution. Marie found herself fighting on two fronts: against the radiation that was already beginning to weaken her blood, and against a social hatred that pointed at her in the street. Her most loyal friends, such as the mathematician Émile Borel, suffered retaliation for defending her, even receiving threats of being dismissed from their posts for giving shelter to the foreigner. What truly hurt Marie was the hypocrisy of a society that celebrated men with multiple mistresses, but was ready to burn at the public stake, a woman seeking solace after years of mourning and exhausting work. This episode left a wound that never fully healed. Marie understood that to the world she would always be a second-class citizen, someone from whom absolute moral perfection would be demanded in exchange for being allowed to conduct research. Despite having given her life and health for the progress of France, at the moment of the scandal, the country she loved turned its back on her, proving that prejudice and the fear of the different are sometimes forces harder to disintegrate than the uranium atom itself. The level of ferocity reached by the Langevin scandal was such that the dispute jumped from the pages of the newspapers into the physical reality of swords and pistols. Paul Langevin, incensed by the way journalist Gustave Thierry had insulted Marie, calling her the Polish woman who came to steal French husbands, challenged him to a duel to the death. On November 25, 1911, both men met at the Velodrome d'Hiver. It was a scene straight out of a 19th century novel. They stood at a distance, but at the last second, neither man fired. Thierry declared that he could not deprive French science of a mind like Langevin's, and the duel ended without bloodshed, but with a public humiliation that only increased the morbid curiosity of Parisian society. In the midst of this emotional and social chaos, Marie received a telegram that should have been the happiest moment of her life. The Swedish Academy was awarding her the 1911 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of radium and polonium. It was the first time in history that a person received 2 Nobel Prizes. However, the joy was short-lived. Upon learning of the scandal in France, some members of the Swedish committee panicked. Svante Arrhenius, an influential Swedish scientist who had previously been a friend of Marie's, wrote her a devastating letter. In it, he suggested, in a less than subtle manner, that she should not travel to Stockholm to receive the prize, arguing that her presence would tarnish the ceremony and that it would be better for her to stay in France until the accusations were proven false. Marie Curie's response is one of the most powerful demonstrations of dignity known in the history of science. With her health broken and her spirits low, she wrote Arrhenius a letter that should be read in every university. She told him with frigid clarity that the prize had been awarded to her for her scientific work, for her discoveries regarding radioactivity and the nature of matter, and that her private life had absolutely nothing to do with the value of her research. Marie was definitive. She would not accept intellectual merits being mixed with slanders regarding her personal feelings. With that decision, she defied not only the Swedish Academy, but the entire patriarchal structure that sought to punish her socially, despite threats that she would be booed and that the press would tear her apart upon her return. Marie boarded the train to Stockholm, accompanied by her eldest daughter Irene, who was 14 at the time. It was an act of absolute bravery. She entered the ceremony hall with her head held high-dressed in her usual black dress, and received her second accolade in front of an auditorium that faced with her mere presence and the undeniable weight of her achievements. Had no choice but to applaud. Marie did not go just to collect a gold medal. She went to claim her right to be judged as a scientist and not as a woman under the microscope of someone else's morality. In doing so, she won the battle against the tabloid press and proved that while the world lost itself in gossip, she remained the absolute master of radium. If the first Nobel Prize in 1903 had been a shared triumph that many tried to attribute primarily to Pierre, the 1911 award was the definitive answer to all those who doubted her intellectual capacity. On this occasion, the Swedish Academy was not rewarding the general phenomenon of radioactivity, but a specific and purely experimental chemical achievement. The discovery of the elements radium and polonium, the isolation of metallic radium, and the study of the nature of these elusive elements. This prize was, in essence, a recognition of her technical mastery and her tenacity in separating matter into its most fundamental components. Marie thus became the first person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different categories, a record she would hold for decades. The importance of this second Nobel lay in the fact that it eliminated any shadow of a doubt regarding her role in the original research. She was no longer just Curie's wife. She was Dr. Marie Curie, the ultimate authority in the new field of radiochemistry. In her acceptance speech in Stockholm, Marie made a gesture that was both a tribute and a demarcation of territory. She acknowledged Pierre's fundamental work, but explained with crystalline clarity what her own contributions had been and how she had continued the research in absolute solitude over the last 5 years. It was a masterclass in how a female scientist claims her intellectual property in front of a world that insisted on making her invisible. The prize arrived at the moment of Marie's greatest physical weakness. Following the ceremony in Sweden, her body finally collapsed. The stress of the Langevin scandal, combined with anemia caused by constant exposure to radium, led to an emergency hospitalization. For months, she had to live under a false name to evade the press while doctors attempted to treat a severe kidney infection and an exhaustion that seemed terminal. However, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry acted as a diplomatic shield. Despite the attacks from the French press, international recognition shielded her. She was no longer simply a professor under attack. She was a figure of global historical importance whom France could not afford to lose. This consecration changed the rules of the game for her. With the prize money and renewed prestige, she was able to push forward with greater force the creation of the Radium Institute. Marie understood that her individual figure was now a powerful political tool. She no longer sought the approval of the Paris Academy of Sciences, which had rejected her shortly before, but looked directly toward history. The 1911 Nobel Prize did not just give her a gold medal, it granted her the freedom to be the sole master of her laboratory and her scientific destiny, establishing a standard of excellence that set her apart from any other researcher of her time. In the autumn of 1911, while the media scandal in Paris was still lashing out with its final drops of venom, Marie Curie traveled to Brussels to participate in one of the most legendary events in the history of science, the first Solvay Conference. This was no ordinary congress where hundreds of people gathered to listen to presentations. It was a private summit funded by the chemistry magnate Ernest Solvay, bringing together only the 24 most brilliant minds in Europe to discuss the deepest problems of modern physics. Imagine the scene. In an elegant room of a Brussels hotel, men like Max Planck, Hendrik Lorentz, Ernest Rutherford, and a young Albert Einstein, who was just beginning to dazzle the world, sat around a table. And there, in the center of that group of men with thick beards and dark suits, was Marie Curie, the only woman present. Marie's presence at Solvay was not an act of courtesy, but a technical necessity. At that moment, classical physics was entering a terminal crisis. Scientists could not understand how the inside of the atom worked, or how energy behaved at minuscule scales. Marie, who had spent more than a decade manipulating matter that disintegrated before her eyes, was the person who held the experimental evidence that everyone else was trying to explain with equations. She did not go there to learn. She went to debate as an equal with the fathers of quantum physics. In fact, an iconic photograph of that meeting exists showing a young and restless Einstein conversing with a colleague, while Marie appears seated reviewing papers with absolute concentration, oblivious to the aura of legend that was already beginning to surround everyone present. It was during this congress that one of the most sincere and respectful friendships in science was forged, that of Marie Curie and Albert Einstein. Einstein, who was not given to unearned praise and possessed a rather irreverent personality, was deeply impressed by Marie's honesty and intelligence. Despite the fact that she was going through the worst moment of her life due to the Langevin scandal, Einstein saw in her an unshakable integrity. Years later, Albert would write that Marie Curie was the only person among all famous scientists whom fame had not managed to corrupt. He defended her publicly against the attacks of the press, sending her a letter telling her not to pay attention to the rabble and to feel proud of her genius. The importance of the Solvay Conference was that it laid the foundations for the atomic revolution. Marie contributed her insights on gamma radiation and the structure of the nucleus, helping her colleagues understand that the atom was not a solid sphere, but a complex and vibrant system. For Marie, being among those giants of physics provided a breath of intellectual oxygen. Far from the noise of the French newspapers in Brussels, she became simply a scientist once again, discussing the nature of electrons and quanta of energy. This event marked the beginning of a new era where she was no longer just a laboratory researcher, but one of the principal architects of the new physics that would dominate the entire 20th century. In August 1914, the world that Marie Curie knew was shattered with the outbreak of the First World War. As the German armies advanced relentlessly toward Paris, the French government packed up its archives and relocated to Bordeaux. Marie was asked to do the same, to safeguard the single gram of radium possessed by the Institute, as it was a national treasure of incalculable value. She fulfilled her duty by carrying the radium in a heavy lead box to a safe in Bordeaux. But instead of remaining sheltered there, she took the return train to the capital in a carriage filled with soldiers. Marie could not sit idly by while thousands of men died on the front lines from wounds that, in many cases, could have been treated if doctors had possessed the proper tools. She understood immediately that wartime medicine was stagnant in the previous century. Military surgeons operated blindly, feeling with their fingers inside bullet wounds to locate fragments of shrapnel, which caused lethal infections or unnecessary amputations. The solution already existed in laboratories: X-rays, discovered by Röntgen years prior. The problem was that radiography machines were enormous, heavy, and required stable electrical installations, something non-existent in the trenches and field hospitals. It was then that Marie Curie, the theorist of the atom, transformed into a combat engineer. She decided that if soldiers could not go to the hospital to get an X-ray, the hospital had to go to the soldiers. Without asking for permission and bypassing all the bureaucracy of the Ministry of War, Marie began to confiscate private cars and delivery vans. With an energy no one knew where she gathered, she convinced mechanical workshops and electrical equipment manufacturers to help her transform these vehicles into mobile radiological laboratories. Her idea was revolutionary: equip each car with an X-ray apparatus, a dynamo connected to the vehicle's engine to generate electricity, and a portable darkroom to develop the plates on the spot. These vehicles, which would soon be known across the front lines as the Petites Curies, represented the birth of modern emergency medicine. Marie did not just design the vehicles, she herself learned to drive something extremely rare for a woman of her era, and studied basic mechanics to be able to change a tire or clean a carburetor amidst the mud of the battlefields. She shed her academic attire and put on a nurse's uniform, traversing combat zones beneath the thunder of artillery. This radiological mobilization was not a state directive, it was an act of individual will. Marie Curie put the full force of physics at the service of human survival, demonstrating that the most advanced science is worthless if it cannot descend into the mud to alleviate the suffering of a wounded man. The woman who had been persecuted by the press years earlier was now viewed by the soldiers as a technical angel who could see through their skin to save their lives. To launch her fleet of salvation, Marie Curie had to transform into a true wartime manager. She had no assigned budget, no personnel, and the military looked upon her with a mixture of suspicion and condescension. However, Marie used her prestige like a sledgehammer to break down doors. She toured the mansions of the wealthiest women in Paris, not to ask for monetary donations, but to demand that they hand over their automobiles. She explained to them with scientific coldness that their luxurious touring cars served little purpose in a city under siege, but on the front lines they could be the difference between life and death. In this way, she managed to assemble the first 20 vehicles that would comprise the core of the Petites Curies. The transformation of these cars was a masterpiece of improvised engineering. Marie designed a system where the automobile's engine did not merely provide locomotion via a transmission belt. It spun a 2-kilowatt dynamo. This energy powered the X-ray tubes that Marie had collected from university laboratories and private practices that had closed due to the war. The interior space of the vans was so restricted that the technician had to work in almost absolute darkness, using black velvet curtains to improvise a darkroom where the photographic plates could be developed. Marie standardized the equipment so that any doctor at any point along the front would know exactly how to operate the machine. But having the machines was not enough. She needed people who knew how to use them without dying in the attempt. Marie organized accelerated training courses at the Radium Institute. She recruited a group of 150 female volunteers, many of them students or nurses, and gave them an intensive course in anatomy, radiation physics, and, most importantly, automotive mechanics. Marie wanted her technicians to be self-sufficient. They had to be capable of producing a perfect plate, interpreting the position of a bullet, and, if the engine failed on a bombed road, getting their hands dirty with grease to fix it. She herself took charge of supervising the examinations, demanding absolute precision because she knew an error in reading the plate could lead a surgeon to cut where they should not. The impact on the battlefield was immediate and near miraculous. When one of these mobile units arrived at a field hospital, the entire atmosphere changed. Surgeons who previously worked blindly and with an appalling mortality rate suddenly possessed a clear vision of the interior of the human body. Marie Curie installed a system where radiography allowed projectiles to be located with an accuracy of millimeters. It is estimated that thanks to these 20 mobile units and the 200 fixed radiological posts that Marie established in rear hospitals, more than 1 million wounded soldiers passed through her equipment. Marie Curie, the woman who had discovered radium, spent 4 years breathing the exhaust of engines and the dust of roads, proving that science is not a luxury for peacetime, but the most potent tool humanity has to defend life in moments of greatest darkness. Marie knew that her personal effort was not enough to cover the hundreds of kilometers of trenches tearing Europe apart. So she converted the Radium Institute into a factory for specialists. She was not looking for theorists. She sought operators capable of working under pressure, in deplorable hygienic conditions, and with the thunder of shells in the background. She recruited a battalion of women, many of them young, with no prior scientific training, and subjected them to fierce training. She taught them physics, basic anatomy, and the art of developing photographic plates and trays. It was one of the first times in history that women were given a critical technical role in the war effort, breaking the mold of the traditional nurse to create the figure of the radiological technician. In this army of science, Marie had her most loyal right hand, her eldest daughter, Irene. At just 17 years old, Irene Curie abandoned her university studies to follow her mother to the battlefront. The relationship between the two transformed into a combat partnership. Irene, who had inherited the mathematical mind and imperturbable character of her parents, demonstrated astonishing maturity. While other young people her age lived far from the horror, she traversed the field hospitals of the French Army zone, sometimes alone, installing X-ray equipment and training doctors who were double or triple her age. Many officers were skeptical upon seeing a teenager arrive in a white lab coat, but they were struck mute when Irene, with frigid precision, calibrated the machines and located fragments of shrapnel that no one else could find. Irene's participation was not a symbolic gesture. She was tasked with directing the radiological service at the field hospital in Hoogstede, Belgium, where she had to deal with atrocious wounds and a constant lack of supplies. Mother and daughter wrote brief, technical letters to each other, discussing voltages, exposure times, and generator malfunctions, as if they were in a climate-controlled laboratory rather than a world falling to pieces. This shared experience forged in Irene the same determination that had led Marie to win 2 Nobel Prizes. She not only learned the physics of radiation, but understood the social responsibility of the scientist. However, this devotion carried an invisible price. Neither Marie nor Irene used adequate protection. In those days, the cumulative effects of X-rays were not fully understood in the heat of battle. Both spent hours in front of fluorescent screens, receiving massive doses of direct radiation while holding the fractured limbs of soldiers to obtain a clear image. Their hands were constantly exposed to the primary beam of light. Marie, with her habitual disdain for personal danger, worried more about the generator's efficiency than the damage her own cells were suffering. Irene, following her mother's example, accepted the risk as part of her duty. Together, these 2 women not only saved limbs and lives, but they established a standard of courage that would lead Irene years later to continue the Curie dynasty all the way to her own Nobel Prize, even if the cost, just as it was for her parents, was her own long-term health. If radiation was an enemy difficult to detect, the French military bureaucracy proved to be a far more stubborn and at times more dangerous adversary. For Marie Curie, winning the war against death at the front meant first winning a war of paperwork and hierarchies in the offices of Paris. The high command of the army, men trained in a rigid and deeply conservative discipline, did not look favorably upon a civilian woman, and a foreign one at that, attempting to give them orders on how to organize military healthcare. For many generals, the petites Curies were nothing more than a nuisance or an eccentricity of a famous scientist who did not understand the logistics of war. Marie had to confront officers who refused to give her fuel for her vehicles because, according to the regulations, the cars were not officially registered as army property. On one occasion, she had to wait entire days to obtain a transit permit that would allow her to cross the lines toward a field hospital where men were bleeding to death. But Marie was not a woman to be intimidated by military stripes. When she encountered a bureaucratic wall, she did not say, "Please." She demanded with the authority of someone who knows she is right and has the lives of thousands of people on her side. She utilized her personal connections and international fame to leap over the heads of bureaucrats, even contacting ministers directly to unblock essential supplies. One of the greatest conflicts was transport. Because the cars had been donated by private citizens, the army refused to repair them in military workshops. Marie, with infinite patience but a will of iron, ended up creating her own logistical network. If a vehicle broke down, she sought the parts herself. If a doctor refused to use the X-ray machine because he preferred the old method of palpating wounds, she installed herself in the hospital and produced the plates herself until the result was so undeniable that the surgeon had no choice but to yield. It was a war of attrition against the mentality of, "It has always been done this way." Even the issue of electricity became a political battle. Many hospital directors complained that Marie's machines consumed too much energy or that the installations were unsafe. Marie responded by installing her own generators and training her staff so they would not depend on anyone. Despite the fact that the French government eventually recognized the value of her work, they never gave her an official rank or a salary for her 4 years of service during the Great War. Marie Curie financed a large part of the operations with her own money and with the gold medals of her Nobel Prizes, which she had attempted to donate to the Bank of France to aid the war effort. In the end, her victory over the bureaucracy was absolute. The army finally accepted that radiology was indispensable. But Marie never received a military medal for it. For her, the only recognition that mattered was knowing that forms lost in an office had not succeeded in stopping the trucks that carried light to the trenches. On November 11th, 1918, the thunder of the cannons finally ceased across the fields of Europe. For Marie Curie, the end of the Great War was not just the cessation of a slaughter she had witnessed from the front lines, but the fulfillment of a dream that had seemed impossible since her childhood in Warsaw. With the collapse of the Central Powers and the signing of the armistice, Poland reappeared on the map as a sovereign nation after more than 120 years of occupation and systematic erasure. Marie, who had spent her entire adult life as an emotional, stateless person, felt a part of her own identity being reconstructed alongside the borders of her homeland. Although Marie was now a French citizen and the entire world identified her with the science of Paris, her heart continued to beat in Polish. During the years of the war, while operating the mobile X-ray units, she never ceased sending letters and support to organizations fighting for Polish independence. For her, the resurrection of her country was a validation of her own personal struggle. She remembered the clandestine classes at the Flying University, where she learned science hidden from Russian inspectors, and felt that her success in the laboratory had been, in a way, a form of national resistance. Now, with a free Poland, her ambition was for Polish science to flourish with the same intensity as French science. This political renaissance brought with it a new mission for Marie. It was no longer just about conducting research in Paris, but acting as a scientific ambassador for the new Republic of Poland. She became a key advisor to the Warsaw government, helping to lay the foundations of what is modern science in that country today. Her great objective was the creation of a radium institute in Warsaw, a twin to the one she directed in France, so that young Polish people would not have to go into exile as she had done to study the secrets of matter. This bond with her homeland grew so strong that, despite her international commitments, Marie traveled constantly to Poland, donating equipment, supervising the training of fellows, and ensuring that her country had access to the most advanced medical technology of the era. The end of the war also brought a belated recognition from France toward her figure, though she received it with her habitual indifference to honors. While the world celebrated peace, Marie found herself physically exhausted and with her life savings gone, as she had invested them almost entirely in war bonds that lost their value. However, she felt no bitterness. Marie advocated for a system that protected the creative work of scientists, not to make them millionaires, but to provide them with the means to continue researching without depending on charity or the whims of the market. It was a very modern vision of science, as a profession that must be valued and protected by the state. Despite her increasingly fragile health, Marie traveled regularly to Geneva for these sessions. In a world that was growing tense once again, due to the rise of nationalisms and hatred, she represented the voice of universal reason. Einstein used to say that Marie was the only one among them all who did not allow herself to be influenced by political passions. For her, intellectual cooperation was the only real vaccine against war. She was convinced that if scientists from all nations worked together, they would create a network of understanding that politicians could not easily break. Her time at the League of Nations was a pioneer's final attempt to build a world where intelligence was at the service of peace, demonstrating that her commitment to humanity went far beyond the limits of a test tube. At the beginning of the 1930s, Marie Curie's body began to exact a definitive and cruel toll for more than 30 years of intimate coexistence with radioactivity. What had previously been passing fatigue or ringing in her ears transformed into a systematic siege against her senses. Marie began to lose her sight at an alarming rate. Her eyes, which had spent decades observing the glow of radium in the dark, were being consumed by bilateral cataracts caused by prolonged exposure to radiation. She had to undergo several surgical operations, interventions that, at the time, were traumatic and slow. For months, the woman who had mapped the interior of the atom lived in almost absolute darkness, blindfolded, dictating letters and laboratory notes to her daughters because she refused to stop working. But the damage was not just on the surface. The enemy was in her blood. Marie suffered from what we know today as a plastic anemia, a condition where the bone marrow, battered by the constant bombardment of alpha and beta particles, stops producing blood cells. Her hands, those that had manipulated tons of ore, were covered with lesions and scars that never completely healed, and her body temperature was almost always feverish. The most striking aspect of this period is Marie's heroic, or perhaps tragic, denial. Despite being the world's foremost expert on radiation, she resisted admitting that her beloved radium was the cause of her agony. When doctors asked about her health, she would deflect the topic toward the voltages of accelerators or the results of her students, treating her own symptoms as if they were annoying noises interrupting her concentration. Her life in the laboratory became a race against time and weakness. She walked through the corridors of the institute, leaning against the walls with a faltering step that she concealed beneath an iron dignity. Sometimes her fingers were so swollen that she could not hold delicate test tubes and had to ask her assistants for help, something that cut deeply into her pride as an experimentalist. Her daughters, Irene and Eve, watched helplessly as their mother withered away. Marie had spent years ignoring the safety protocols she herself had begun to draft for others. She kept samples of radium in the pockets of her lab coat and slept with luminescent test tubes on her nightstand because she liked their light. For her, danger was an acceptable price for knowledge, a transaction she accepted without complaining even once. The physical deterioration of Marie Curie was the ultimate sacrifice of a pioneer. While the outside world saw her as an unmovable bronze figure, she was disintegrating at a cellular level, a victim of the very fire she had brought to Earth. There was no bitterness in her pain, only a deep sadness at not being able to see clearly the new discoveries occurring in nuclear physics. In these final years, her hunched figure and trembling hands were living testimony to an inescapable scientific truth. The energy that can heal and power the world is the same that can destroy life from its deepest roots. Marie was paying with her own blood the toll for having opened the door to a new era for humanity. Even when her body was a mere shadow of what it once was, the laboratory remained the only place where the world made sense to Marie. In those final years, between 1930 and 1934, the Radium Institute was not just her workplace, but her personal refuge and her fortress. While doctors begged her to rest in the countryside or take a vacation, Marie continued to appear every morning in her office at the same time as always. Her routine was sacred, though her legs could barely climb the stairs, and her eyesight forced her to wear impressively thick lenses. She needed to smell the chemical reagents and hear the hum of the electroscopes to feel alive. For Marie Curie, the laboratory was not a building, it was a state of mind. The most moving aspect of this final stage was her relationship with young researchers. Marie had become an almost mythical figure walking the hallways. But she was not a distant director. She sat with her students to review photographic plates, sometimes spending hours discussing the trajectory of a particle with a passion that made her forget her own aches and pains. Despite her weakness, her rigor had not diminished by a single millimeter. If an experiment was not perfect, she ordered it repeated without hesitation. She was known for her deathly silence while working, a silence broken only when she found a data point that did not fit established theories. In those moments, her tired eyes regained a youthful spark, the same one she had when she was a poor student at the Sorbonne. Marie carried a small notebook with her where she jotted down not only scientific data, but reflections on the behavior of the elements she herself had named. She spent hours in the Institute's garden, which she had planted with roses and linden trees years before, but she always ended up returning to the weighing rooms. One day in 1934, despite running a very high fever that indicated her immune system was practically gone, Marie insisted on going to the laboratory to perform one last measurement on a radium sample. Her hands shook so much she nearly dropped the vial, but she managed to finish the task. It was the last time she manipulated the substance that had defined her destiny. That very afternoon, she was forced to leave the institute, leaving her lab coat hanging on the coat rack as if she were to return the next day. Even on her sickbed at her home in Paris, before being transferred to the sanatorium, Marie kept a thermometer and a notebook on her nightstand. She recorded her own fever with the precision of a laboratory observation, analyzing her own decline as if it were a physical phenomenon external to herself. There was no fear in her gaze, only an analytical curiosity that accompanied her until the end. The laboratory was her home, her temple, and ultimately, the place where she surrendered every gram of her energy. Marie Curie did not die as a retiree, but as an active researcher who simply ran out of time to finish the next experiment. Her final breath was imbued with the same unwavering commitment that led her to change the course of human history from a humble wooden shed. In the final years of her life, Marie had the privilege of witnessing the seed she had planted decades earlier blossom into a new generation of giants. The Radium Institute had become a true factory of geniuses, an ecosystem where minds from all over the world gathered to learn under the gaze of the woman who had started it all. But among all her students, two stood out above the rest and represented the biological and intellectual continuation of her legacy: her daughter Irene and her son-in-law Frédéric Joliot. Watching them work together in the laboratory was, for Marie, like seeing a renewed version of her own story with Pierre, a perfect partnership where physical intuition and chemical mastery fused to assault the secrets of the atomic nucleus. At the beginning of 1934, just a few months before Marie passed away, Irene and Frédéric achieved a discovery that shook the foundations of science: artificial radioactivity. Until that moment, it was believed that radioactivity was an exclusive property of certain heavy elements found in nature, such as uranium or radium. However, the Joliot Curies demonstrated that it was possible to bombard stable elements like aluminum to make them artificially radioactive. Marie was a direct witness to this historic moment. It is said that when Frédéric showed her the first man-made radioactive isotope in a test tube, Marie, already nearly blind and very weak, took the small vial in her battered hands and observed it with restrained emotion. It was the final validation of her life. Humanity no longer depended solely on what it found in the earth. It had learned to master the energy of the atom at its own will. This discovery would earn Irene and Frédéric the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935, just 1 year after Marie's death. Although she did not live to see the ceremony in Stockholm, she died with the absolute certainty that the name Curie would continue to illuminate history books. But the success of her students was not limited to her family. Under her direction, the institute trained scientists who would later return to their home countries, from China to Brazil, to found their own nuclear programs and radiotherapy centers. Marie did not guard her knowledge like an alchemical secret. She handed it down with a pedagogical generosity that created a global network of knowledge. For Marie, the success of Irene and Frédéric was proof that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. Seeing her daughter reach the pinnacle of world science gave her a profound peace in her darkest days. She knew the torch was in good hands, and that the path she had cleared with a machete through prejudice and precariousness was now a highway for new researchers. The Joliot Curies inherited not only her laboratories and her radium samples, but also her unyielding work ethic and her disdain for commercial patents. The discovery of artificial radioactivity was the final gift Marie received from science, a sign that the future she had imagined was already here, and that her intellectual lineage was destined to change the world forever. By the end of June 1934, Marie Curie's state of health became untenable. What was initially diagnosed as a severe case of the flu or the reactivation of an old tubercular lesion turned out to be the terminal phase of pernicious aplastic anemia. Following the advice of doctors and the insistence of her daughter Eve Marie, was transferred to the St. Salomo's Sanatorium in Haute-Savoie in the hope that the pure air of the Alpine mountains might work a miracle on her lungs and her blood. However, the train journey was torture for her. She was so weak she could barely hold herself upright, and her temperature did not drop below 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere in the sanatorium possessed an unreal calm that contrasted with Marie's internal restlessness. Even in her moments of delirium, her mind remained anchored to the laboratory. Eve Curie, who accompanied her until her very last breath, related years later how her mother in the semi-darkness of the room moved her hands with precise gestures, as if she were manipulating invisible instruments or jotting down results in an imaginary notebook. She did not ask for religious comfort, nor did she lament her fate. Her final struggle was purely biological. At dawn on July 4th, 1934, the heart of the woman who had discovered radium stopped beating. She was 66 years old, and her body was so saturated with radiation that even decades later, her remains would continue to be a source of particle emission. The medical report was unusual and direct. The disease was a rapid, feverish aplastic anemia. The bone marrow did not react, probably because it had been damaged by a long accumulation of radiations. Marie Curie died a victim of her own discovery, a martyr to human curiosity who never accepted protecting herself from that which she loved to investigate. She was buried 2 days later in the cemetery of Sceaux, in a strictly private ceremony, in the same tomb where Pierre Curie rested. There were no official speeches, no marching bands, no military parades, just a handful of friends, colleagues, and her 2 daughters throwing handfuls of Polish soil over her coffin. The death of Marie Curie marked the end of a heroic era in science. She represented the transition between 19th century physics and the atomic age of the 20th century. Her departure left an immense void in the international scientific community, but it also left a legacy of absolute integrity. Marie left the world just as she had lived, with a radical sobriety and a total devotion to the truth. She left behind no great fortunes or properties, but she left a map of the heart of matter that would allow humanity to dream of curing diseases and understanding the very origin of the universe. In San Salomo's, It was not just a scientist who died. The flame of a will had been extinguished, a will that had proven that neither hunger, nor prejudice, nor disease could stop a human being determined to unravel the secrets of nature. To enter Marie Curie's mind, to understand her relationship with danger, is like trying to decipher an enigma of quantum physics. We are not talking about a careless or ignorant person, but rather the world's foremost authority on the subject, who paradoxically lived with her own death in her pockets. To understand if she was aware of the risk, we must first rid our minds of the idea that everything about radiation was already known in those early days. In the opening years of the 20th century, radium was viewed almost as a miraculous substance, a kind of philosopher's stone that emitted infinite energy. Marie and Pierre saw how radium burned the skin, yes, but their first conclusion was not one of fear, but of medical utility. If radium can destroy human tissue, then it can destroy a tumor. That was the logic that gave birth to curiotherapy, which in a way blinded Marie to the systemic dangers that could not be seen with the naked eye. Marie worked in an era when portable Geiger counters and lead suits did not exist. Her laboratory was an extension of her home, and her body was the primary measuring instrument. Historical accounts tell us that she enjoyed the aesthetic beauty of her discovery. It is said that in the darkness of the laboratory, Marie would stand gazing at the vials containing purified radium salts, which emitted a ghostly blue glow. She described them in her diaries as faint fairy lights, what any high school student today would identify as a lethal dose of ionizing radiation attacking her retinas. For her, it was the visual manifestation of the purity of matter. This almost mystical fascination with the glow of radium is perhaps the greatest proof that her awareness of danger was filtered through an unshakable scientific romanticism. As the years passed, the physical signs became impossible to ignore. Her fingers were perpetually inflamed, the skin hardened and cracked by the burns of alpha particles. Marie referred to these symptoms almost dismissively, as if they were mere occupational hazards, minor inconveniences compared to the magnitude of the data she was collecting. There is an interesting turning point when she herself began drafting the first safety protocols for her students at the Radium Institute. She asked them to use lead shields and to avoid handling the substances directly. In other words, Marie was aware that radiation could be harmful to others, but she seemed to believe that she, through a kind of immunity earned in the trenches of knowledge, was safe, or at least that her sacrifice was a contract she had already signed for the benefit of posterity. Even when her health definitively collapsed, Marie maintained a stance of technical denial. She never publicly admitted that radium was responsible for her anemia. When doctors in the Alps tried to diagnose her constant fever and exhaustion, she would deflect the conversation toward nuclear physics. It is highly probable that in her heart of hearts, Marie knew perfectly well that it was killing her. She was not a woman to make calculation errors. However, to admit that radium was a poison would have felt to her like betraying the element to which she had dedicated every second of her existence since 1897. Marie preferred to die as a researcher who had simply run out of strength, rather than as a victim of her own discovery. Today, her notebooks continue to emit radioactivity that forces us to handle them with lead gloves, an eternal echo of a woman who decided that scientific truth was worth far more than her own biological integrity. To understand the magnitude of what Marie Curie achieved in her laboratory, we must travel mentally to the end of the 19th century, when science believed the atom was the ultimate, indivisible unit of reality. It was thought that atoms were like tiny billiard balls, solid, eternal, and immutable. But Marie, working with tons of a mineral called pitchblende in a shed that leaked when it rained, discovered that some atoms were literally exploding. She was the first person to use the term radioactivity to describe this phenomenon. What Marie understood before anyone else was that this energy did not come from a chemical reaction between molecules, but instead welled up from the very heart of the atom. This finding shattered classical physics into 1,000 pieces. She demonstrated that the atom was not the end of the story. It had an internal structure, an engine that could break apart and release a potency that humanity had not even dreamed of, Not only did she discover two new elements, polonium and radium, but she opened the door to a new dimension of reality, where matter and energy are two sides of the same coin. Imagine that the nucleus of an atom is like a gathering of people in a room that is far too small. In stable elements, like the oxygen we breathe, everyone is comfortable and stays in their place. But in elements like uranium or radium, the nucleus is so large and contains so many particles that it becomes unstable. There is too much tension. The decay of the atom is basically the process by which that nucleus decides to shed weight to try and find balance. In this act of physical desperation, the atom hurls pieces of itself into space at incredible speeds. It is a kind of partial atomic suicide. Marie Curie observed that this process was completely spontaneous and independent of external factors. It did not matter if you cooled radium until it froze, or if you heated it to a red-hot glow. The atom kept decaying at its own rhythm. This concept of nuclear decay altered our understanding of time and matter, revealing that nature has internal clocks that have been ticking since the dawn of creation. When an atom decays, it doesn't just throw out anything. It fires three distinct types of projectiles. Understanding the difference between them is vital to grasping why Marie's work was both so dangerous and so fascinating. First, we have alpha particles. Imagine them as heavy, slow-moving bullets made up of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. They are powerful, but have very little range. A simple sheet of paper, or even the outer layer of your skin, can stop them. The real danger of alpha particles occurs if you breathe them in or swallow them, because once inside, they wreck your cells like a truck crashing through glass. Next are beta particles. These are much smaller, essentially electrons launched at high speed. They have more penetrating power and can pass through the skin, requiring a sheet of aluminum to be stopped. Finally, we have gamma rays. Here we are no longer talking about particles, but about waves of pure energy like light, only infinitely more potent. Gamma rays are the ghosts of radiation. They pass through almost everything in their path, including human tissue and walls, and can only be slowed down by thick blocks of lead or meters of concrete. Marie Curie lived with this invisible bombardment of alpha, beta, and gamma rays every single day, receiving a constant impact that dismantled her own cellular structure while she attempted to measure the weight of the elements. One of the strangest and most magical concepts to emerge from the investigations of the Curies and their successors is transmutation. For centuries, alchemists tried to turn lead into gold and failed miserably because they were trying to do it through chemistry. Marie proved that nature does it all the time through nuclear physics. When a radium atom decays and expels a particle, it stops being radium and transforms into something else, like radon, and then into polonium, until it finally becomes lead and comes to rest. It is a constant metamorphosis. To measure how long this process takes, we use the concept of half-life. This does not mean how long an individual atom lives, but rather how much time it takes for a sample of an element to be reduced to half its mass. For example, radium-226 has a half-life of about 1,600 years. This means that if Marie left 1 gram of radium on her desk in 1900, by the year 3500, there will still be half a gram left, continuing to emit its blue light. It is a timescale that escapes human comprehension, allowing us to date everything from dinosaur fossils to the age of the most distant stars. Marie Curie did not want her discoveries to remain a laboratory curiosity. She was obsessed with saving lives. Thus was born Curiotherapy, which we know today as brachytherapy. The idea was as simple as it was bold. If radium emits radiation that destroys cells, let us place tiny needles or seeds charged with radioactive material directly inside or near a cancerous tumor. The goal was to burn the cancer from the inside out, minimizing damage to the surrounding healthy tissue. It was the first time humanity possessed a real, effective weapon against a disease that, until then, had been a certain death sentence. Marie worked tirelessly to standardize dosages and to ensure that hospitals had access to radium emanations. Today, When a patient enters an oncology ward to receive state-of-the-art radiotherapy via linear accelerators or nuclear medicine, they are walking down a path that Marie Curie charted with her own burned hands. Her scientific inheritance is found not just in nuclear power plants or weaponry, but in every person who manages to beat cancer, because a Polish woman decided that the glow of pitchblende could become a beacon of hope. At the end of the road, the figure of Marie Curie rises above technical data and accolades to become something far rarer, a symbol of moral purity. We are speaking of a woman who discovered the key to an energy that could power cities or incinerate them, and who decided not to profit a single penny from it. Marie represents scientific integrity in its most absolute state. In a world where science today sometimes seems shackled to corporate interests or million-dollar patents, she reminds us that knowledge is a common good. Marie and Pierre made the conscious decision to publish their methods for isolating radium without any restrictions, allowing any researcher in any corner of the planet to continue their work. She did not want to own radium. She wanted radium to usher in a new era of healing. Her life was a declaration of principles. Curiosity has no price, and truth is non-negotiable. To be a scientist, for Marie, was a form of secular priesthood where the only altar was the laboratory bench and the only dogma was experimental rigor. But every revolution comes with a price, and Marie Curie's was particularly costly. Her story forces us to reflect on the responsibility borne by those who dare to pull back the veil of nature. Marie was the first to peer into the abyss of the atomic nucleus, and although her intention was purely humanitarian, the energy she unleashed changed the scale of human power forever. Here arises the eternal dilemma of the researcher. Is the scientist responsible for the use that society makes of their findings? Marie lived long enough to see how radium was used to cure cancer, but she died before seeing that same nuclear physics transform into the shadow of the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. However, she always maintained that humanity would draw more good than harm from new discoveries. Her own life was the payment for that progress. She was the biological sensor that warned us of the dangers we could not see. The cost of progress was not just her health, but the loss of innocence for a science that from her time onward could never again pretend to be detached from the political and social consequences of its experiments. Today, more than a century after her greatest discoveries, Marie Curie remains the compass guiding new generations of researchers. Her relevance is found not just in textbooks, but in the daily struggle for diversity and inclusion within laboratories. Marie broke glass ceilings that, in her era, were made of reinforced concrete. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, the first person to win 2 in different categories, and the first woman to hold a professorship at the Sorbonne. Yet beyond the records, her enduring legacy resides in her method, that infinite patience required to filter tons of earth just to find a grain of truth. In the age of artificial intelligence and massive particle accelerators, Marie's spirit warns us that a scientist's most powerful tool remains their own willpower and capacity for critical observation. She is the mother of modern physics, but also the protector of all those who, despite having everything against them, decide that the pursuit of knowledge is the noblest adventure a human being can undertake. They say that if you enter the crypt of the Pantheon in Paris today and approach Marie Curie's tomb, the air seems to vibrate in a different way. She rests there in a lead-lined coffin because her body continues to emit that energy she loved so much. It is a perfect metaphor for her existence, a woman who consumed herself to illuminate the rest of humanity. Marie passed away in the summer of 1934, but that radiance she watched over in her laboratory on Rue Cuvier never truly went out. It lives on in every X-ray plate, in every nuclear medicine treatment, and in every young person who looks up at the stars, wondering what the universe is made of. Marie Curie is not just a name on a street or an element on the periodic table. She is the perpetual fire of human intelligence, refusing to surrender to the darkness. Her story tells us that we are stardust, but a stardust capable of understanding the laws that govern it. Her story ends here, but the glow of her legacy will continue to shine, tireless and eternal, as long as there is someone willing to ask why. I hope you enjoyed this narrative and that it helped you relax while listening to a bit of great history. This is Ka, your faithful companion for your sleepless nights. If you liked the story, leave a thumbs up and subscribe to become part of this cultured nightly community. Let me know in the comments what other topic you would like us to discuss in an upcoming video. We read every comment carefully. Thank you for listening, and until our next adventure.